PowerPoints. So is it okay for you if we are sitting here?
Yeah, I will sit there.
Okay.
So everyone should see.
Mä voin laittaa. I put it like a little, just halfway or so, because I...
Ah, okay. This is her.
Kyllä, ja mä testattu tää.
Don't know where she went.
Ah, okay, you sent a message.
Yeah, I sent a message. Yeah.
But I think we need to wait for her.
Okay, there she is.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we can start and then I'll turn it on.
So does she see me and hear me?
We put the camera towards the audience because that's how she wants it. But maybe we can turn it for the beginning if you want. So we can.
No, don't.
Okay. Yeah. So it's just you can see here. She can see the audience.
Okay. I hope she can hear us. Yes.
Yes, she can hear us now.
So Greta, can you hear us?
Yep. Tarvitaanko me tää nyt jo auki?
Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our conference. I hope you made it here without falling. We have swapped the keynotes in respect to our initial program. So the first keynote will be by Professor Greta Olson. She hasn't been well enough to travel to Turku, so we will have her via Skype. I'm glad that it has been possible to arrange this in this way, and because everything is set up now in technical terms, we will go first with this keynote, and then it will be followed by the keynote by Andrea Rittivoi. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Greta Olson, Professor of English and American Literature and Cultural Studies at the Justus Liebig University in Giessen, Germany. Professor Olson's research focuses on law and literature, on the interconnections between politic and artistic practices, the politics of form, critical media studies, feminism and sexuality studies. She's the author of Criminals and Animals, from Shakespeare to Lombroso, from the Greuter from 2013. And also she's the editor of numerous collective volumes and special issues, and I won't be able to mention them all here. Most recent of them are The Politics of Form with Sarah Copeland from Routledge, 2018. And the second one, How to Do Things with Narrative, Cognitive and Diachronic Perspectives from De Gruyter, also 2018. She's also general editor of European Journal of English Studies and the co-founder of the European Network of Law and Literature. So without further ado, I will give, if not floor, the channel to Professor Greta Olson. So please join me in welcoming her via Skype.
Thank you, everyone. And I would ask you, as if I were in front of you, to please raise your hand or yell if you can't hear me, so that we can see that this is working reasonably enough. And I want to say I'm a person with a huge amount of physical energy, that if I could leap through this screen and be with you now, that is what I'd like to do. Higher powers decided that my stomach would empty itself repeatedly for the last 3 days, so you really don't want me there. But I want to say how disappointed I am, because this is a wonderful project, and have never been to Finland, and also that it is being led by 3 wonderful women professors is also a bit of gender activism in itself, and something that I don't see happening in Germany. So let's say, also, as mentioned, is from 2018, which is the one I care about the most, is Beyond Gender, Futures of Feminism and Sexuality Studies. And as you'll see at the end of the talk, that's where my research is going now. So with no further ado, and with the kindness of Rika, we are, I hope this is going to work. I can't see the PowerPoint, so she is doing the PowerPoint with me. I'd like to get to my talk. And it is about, why do we need a narrative research for nuanced analysis of political trends? And what I have been doing repeatedly during the last few years in different areas, the area that I'm actually best known for is law, but also in media studies, in narrative studies, in sexuality studies, is to say, how can we take the narrow out of narratology? How can we make this form-based analysis work in doing forms of ideological critique? I also would like to talk about how we can, to the degree we can, narrativize mono images and moving images while not forgetting issues of visual literacy and visual studies, so as not to cannibalize everything out there through narrative studies. I'm going to briefly critique what I see as the narrative premise, which is the idea, it seems to me a quasi-religious belief, that narrative is the most basic and fundamental form of world-making, and suggest why we need to add to that with affect studies, tropic studies, and work on mediality. And then that's a big theoretical frame. I'm going to give you a case study of work that I'm doing on 3 competing larger, I call them dominant narratives of migration and refugeeism in images of refugees from the German context, because I live in Germany in the Frankfurt area. And then I'm going to show you other possibilities that we could do with this work. Okay, so I need to kind of walk with you through why narratology can be used to perform political and sociological analysis, because I don't think that's immediately self-evident for you. And as I wrote with wonderful Sarah, I think that a politics of form begins to address the need for the development of a political analysis of aesthetic and narrative forms, to articulate specific models and methods for performing such analysis, and to reflect on the politics of the work that is thereby undertaken. So part of the critique is also self-critique, as going back through Kant and critique of Reine Vernunft, that to critique oneself as one is performing the critique in one's specific political position. And the aim of this work is to politicize narrative studies and formal analysis, while retaining, which I believe is very helpful about a kind of studies that we've all been trained in, form specificity, and also a thinking about that universalizing tendency of narrative studies, what specific form works in a same or similar way in different contexts. This involves political aesthetics, and just to give you in the briefest way, a lot of people have thought about what are political aesthetics, what are formal notions of the aesthetics, so I'm just mentioning two ideas, one by Sartwell. The political content of an ideology can be understood in large measure actually to be identical with its formal and stylistic aspects. There's no difference between the form and the actual ideological content, which is a big notion in itself. And with Jacques Rancière, that the political is inherently aesthetic and form-based, and because it presupposes a particular sphere of existence, of objects posited as common and as pertaining to a common decision, of subjects recognized as capable of designating these objects and putting forward arguments about them. And so for Rancière, actually the political is to become aware of formal differentiations. And it's going beyond a notion of political science in the traditional sense. So, and now on slide 5, Rika, just so that we're on the same page.
Yes.
Thank you. Politics of form, then, would be based on, in the largest sense, narrative categories, but also interacting with other forms of textual analysis. And again, I think a critique that has been made on narrative studies is a cannibalization of other fields and not taking those fields as seriously as we as narratologists might do so. So this would include, for me, form-oriented television and film studies, and also thinking about how other fields can be used to refine our categories, to show how narratological models can be expanded, as in sometimes a political aesthetical analysis, and in cultural narratology, where I'm most at home, where I'm doing work with law, for instance, this will result in an elucidation of the narrative features of actual historical events. So thinking about political and historical phenomena in terms of narratological analysis. So, what we all do when me lecturing to you at this moment, thank you for bearing with me in this form, or when we are doing writing, which is in general the way we express ourselves as scholars, is we narrativize. And we impose, if you will, storytelling techniques on the phenomena that we're looking at. And part of this is now, since many of us are working multimedially, I am working on images a lot, is to narrativize the images that we look at, but that also includes affective responses. So narrative, of course, most narratologists begin with the definition of narrative. Here's my working one. I understand it in with Eleanor Roche in kind of a fuzzy theory prototype, that there isn't a closed circle of narrative, there's a spectrum of narrative. And it exists along the continuum of text and phenomena, and to refer to those that more or less allow themselves to be narrativized, to have narratological methods used to take them apart. And that is to be cognitively processed as stories and as having the story-like elements or narrativity, what others would call narrativehood, that trigger in us our story detecting processes and those with who in and highly narrative texts, I would say with Vanna Wolff, tend to be have more verbal elements, yet mono images can also be narrativized. Further, narrative or narrativity describes the degree to which a text or object or political phenomena possesses qualities that elicit thinking structures that lead people to treat and engage with it as a narrative. As the complementary term narrativization describes the procedure, it's what I'm doing right now and what you're doing and listening to me and hopefully making sense of what I'm saying, describes the procedure by which a text is processed in someone's mind in response to its story-like qualities. And again, I use prototype theory to think about what I mean by narrative. Now that is all wonderful, but I find in a lot of narrative analysis, even when it's not treating exclusively verbal text, that it tends to leave out a lot of what I see as very important, which is also in the largest sense form function analysis. So what might be missing from that embroidered and large narratological model? I would say I would take what I see as the triangle of medial analysis, and I'm working with Douglas Kellner, with others, and elaborating on that. So when I'm working on a medial text, but really on any kind of text, I think of it as existing within a triangle, and that all three of those triangles need to be addressed as I look at it with others or with students. The most important of which, borrowing from Marx, would be political economy, and that is to think about what is the economic or material situation in which a narrative text or narrative phenomena occurs. If this is a medial text, who's making it, for what reason, who's profiting from it? I think that in thinking about narrative contextually, we also have to think of ourselves as living in an economic universe, and that's determining a great deal of what we do. The second part of the triangle would be text analysis. This is, I believe, what we're more used to doing in humanities program, which is to look at genre, semiotic, sound, and moving images. Text-based analysis, text-intrinsic analysis. But a third part of the triangle would be ethnography, to also think about how any narrative text or phenomena is also received within a different context and in different situations, and that also determines its effects or interactions with the world. So I'm now at slide 9.
Yes.
I think the narrative turn, as I would call it, as it's been called, that took place perhaps in the 80s, depending on who's doing the historicization, has been very gratifying for those of us in the humanities, like myself, who do narrative studies. It suggested that we're very important, and it's looked to narrative as the basis of sociological research. It has allowed somebody like me, a humble English professor, to get invited to big law schools in the United States. I think that helped me to get an apartment here. That impressed my landlady. All well and good. But what may be problematic about that narrative assumption, that narrativization or that narrative structuring is the most basic kind of world making, is that it is an essentialization and it tends to leave out some other things. So very often analyses that invoke narratology tend to reify narrative as the founding articulation of homo significans, leaving the structures, capacities, and activities of narrative itself unproblematized. In other words, narrative becomes an Archimedean point by positing it as a universal, innate human capacity that is shared by all people, even when it is recognized as contingent upon particular socio-historical formations. So I want to push back, as a narratologist, against that narrative premise. And just to give you one of the foundational texts, it's very important in law. Jerome Brunner posits the narrative construction of reality. Brunner is widely accredited with having popularized the thesis that identity is constructed through narrative means, with the self as storyteller. And of course, there's more larger group identity work. Anderson, I could name a whole bunch of other ones that move from a particular narrative construction of identity to a group construction of identity. And I'd like to criticize the essentialist assumption about humans as narrating beings that underlie narrative studies of sociocultural phenomena. Such assumptions, I'm afraid, ignore the socio-historical specificity of narrational settings. They suggest that narrative world-making is something continuous that is always the same, and forms and assume the ubiquity of narrating as the primary form of world-making. I'd like to add to the idea that we are narrative animal, homo narrans, as Joseph Slaughter calls us critically, with the idea that we are also affective animals and figural animals, that we also work very strongly visually. And affect, and I'm giving you here a quote by Brian Masumi based upon the work of Deleuze and Guattari, is, as I understand it, and there are different genealogies of affect, but it's the difference between what do we do when we express ourselves verbally, and I say, I feel very embarrassed about something I said unkind to someone I care for last night, in which that initial sensation has been translated in feeling and is then narrated verbally. And the original feeling was, I realized I said something unkind, and my face got red, and the hair stood on end, or I got cold. Physical sensation of feeling, literally a sensation, what called affect. So what happens in our body before we translate it. I want to suggest that we need to think about affect studies, how we react before we translate things verbally into emotions very seriously in our narratological work. I also want to suggest, as I understand it, that tropes, or in the larger sense metaphor, is as basic as narrative, and that the processes of creating metaphors or tropes is conjoined with processes of making sense of the world through narrative. Metaphor arises in cognitive processes and is as basic a sense-making structure and as akin to narrativization. I call it metaphorization. And narrative also can never be free of the tropic or the metaphorical, since metaphor is intrinsic to language, and narrative is conveyed most readily through linguistic means. Narrative is also never free, plain, and non-ideological. So what do I mean by ideology? Let me give you a working definition. Whose ideology, whose politics? When we're saying politely about an opinion that doesn't agree with ours, we tend to say it's political. When we're angry or really don't like it, we say it's ideological. My understanding of ideology consists of the invisible inscription of biased power relations within a culture through aesthetic, scientific, and legal discourses, as well as lived experience. Ideology is, to my mind, what makes a given set of social relations, including the subjugation of one group by another, appear natural and normative to its participants. Ideologies work through processes of coercion, convention, and consent, and tend to uphold status quos of hegemonic power relations. So as I'm continuously saying to my students in gender-related and feminist courses, it's not men against women, let's question that binary at the beginning. It's also how women consent to and uphold patriarchy that we live in because it feels good to them for one reason or another. So let me take that as the kind of larger theoretical model that I'm working with in all of the work I do. So expanding narratology, questioning the narratological premise, bringing in medial studies and also ideological critique as well as affect studies to say, okay, so what are you actually doing? Let me try to make that more visible, more haptic to you, if you will, more effectively resonant by giving you a case study. I'm working a great deal on what I see in the larger sense as dominant narratives about migration and refugeeism in the German context. And this is, in Germany, for the last few years, the political issue, and it deeply divides us in Germany, where we stand on this issue. It's the reason that Merkel is no longer the head of the party and will probably soon also not be chancellor. And it is the most contentious issue, political issue in Germany right now. My initial findings, looking at a great number, and I've been looking at images, so visual mono images of immigration and refugeeism, and saying what kind of, but not just photographs, what kind of dominant narratives are behind those, is to say that individual narratives of refugees tend to signal feelings of attachment and empathy affectively, whereas generalized ones are or can be employed to generate feelings of hostility and fear towards refugees. And that there are, as I contend, three basic types of gendered and ethno-sexualized, and I'll take that word apart in a minute, images of what I would say are preferred victims and preferred perpetrators in images of refugees. And the questions I'm asking about this research are how do specific types of images of refugees contribute to the support or undermining of claims to asylum, so have political effects, and to the claim that migration is a basic human right, as is increasingly being argued. And I also want to ask, how are these images and their underlying narratives gendered in ideologically important ways? So I believe there are three types of images, and the first type is one that dehumanizes and marginalizes refugees by presenting them as a and it's always a them, it's not a single one, a generalized or specific form of threat. And very often this is, as an ideology so wonderfully and malevolently does, it suggests that this is a natural threat. So it's higher power and works with us effectively that way. So you're now looking at the image of the tidal wave, waves of Syrian refugees in Europe. And we could say a lot about this. There are about a zillion cartoons, and this is important when you're doing cultural studies. You can't just have one text that is doing these very interesting things because you'll be accused of anecdotalism. I then look to historians to say I need to have 10 texts that are doing similar things in order to have a case for what I'm doing. There are a million cartoons that look like this. You can see it's a tsunami of refugees. They are undifferentiated. What we can see is all these bodies. They all have black hair. And they're a tidal wave or a tsunami, and they're about to, if you will, drown that little white couple. This being a Northern European couple, they should have 1/3 of a child between them on the beach. And the idea here, or the underlying tropes, as I would say, in this image, are that refugees are crisis. And this is inclusive in the notion that refugees shall destroy us like an environmental crisis, or a tidal wave, as in the German Flüchtlingskrise, refugee crisis. And I note with alarm when in your language crisis is used to describe an influx of refugees, because it's a very highly, effectively resonant word. Refugees are an unstoppable stream, as in Flüchtlingsstrom. Again, making equivalent that this group of refugees is like a natural threat that has to be stopped, and refugees are a tidal wave that shall destroy us or our land, the body politic of Europe that you saw in that last slide. So, refugeeism has a complex history, and it also has to be thought about comparatively, because I'm also an Americanist. In the larger project I'm doing in the United States, I'm going to not do very much on that. I'm going to focus more on Germany today. But a unified, and Finland will have its own history with refugeeism. A unified Germany has only recently come to terms with thinking about itself as a nation that admits migration, even as the debates about immigration have repeatedly polarized German society during the past 3 decades. This development runs parallel to the horizontal conversions of policies regarding asylum, relocation, and border controls, and here the word would be Frontex in the EU, that increasingly EU policy works horizontally, that countries look to each other in their policies and work together. The post-1990 period reunification has been further punctuated by the influx of asylum seekers, particularly during the 1990s, during the Balkan Wars, and the so-called, again, I try not to use the term, refugee crisis in 2014 and 2015. In 2015, about 1.25 million refugees were admitted to Germany, and the so-called Ereignis in Köln in 2015. On New Year's Eve in Cologne in 2015, there were over 1,000 reported attacks, many by refugee seekers, some by Germans as well, of women and girls at the Cologne train station, where people gathered to watch fireworks at midnight. Subsequent to this, we saw a lot of images like the following: refugees not welcome. You're going to, I think, recognize this image right away, because you know the image behind it, that it's flipping, which is refugees welcome. And this refugees welcome also has a wonderful history that goes back to the United States. The image of a family, father, mother, and child fleeing, was originally intended for a California rail highway where people were crossing from Mexico, and it was meant, little girl with pigtails, to signal to people, hey, be careful driving, because people may be running across the highway. And that refugees welcome sign, it's everywhere. I see it tattooed on people. I see it in demonstrations for refugee rights. And it's in logos, for instance, in the women's bathrooms all over the university where I work. This image flips it around with the word refugees rather than refugees, and with the young woman and the 3 a family, mother, father, child, are now 3 men running behind her. Note how the woman's, and to arouse affective sympathy, we tend to treat people singularly. The woman's singularity, her askew arms and legs and hair floating behind her in flight, signals her vulnerability and announces that she has no family or friends to defend her besides the implied viewer, who is interpreted into the picture, you need to protect this young woman. This solitary victim figure as a preferred victim has a larger capacity to evoke empathy than if she were depicted in a group. Combining visual and verbal elements, this type of image serves to criminalize as well as dehumanize refugee men. It suggests that the present and palpable and continuous threat to our German women. And shortly afterwards, a woman named Tanja Festerling from the Alternative for Germany party said, these men are attacking our blonde German women. They are, as was often said in reporting, a horde of pursuers that is so it happened on a verbal and a visual level, a horde of pursuers that is de-individualized in the same way individual migrants are de-individualized in verbal and in visual expressions such as the cartoon you saw as a tsunami of migrants. The men bear weapons and chase after a lone woman, so suggesting that they're also terrorists and criminals. And the third of these men is marked as Muslim, and particularly to his garment, which looks like a throat. A similar image is this one also, the beginning of 2016. Very briefly it says, women demand action after these sex attacks from migrants. Are we tolerant or are we already blind? And the issue here of the normatively sexually attractive young blonde woman covered with black hands is racist and very disturbing, both through the sexualization of the woman and through the racial work which is going on in various levels in this image. So this kind of work is ethnosexualizing. It's a form of cultural racism in which foreigners are depicted as innately and uncivilized. It works on Islamophobia, which is prevalent not only in German society. The foreigner rapist is the object of this phobia. The native girl, as in the quote from Tanja Festerling, needs to be protected. And the perpetrators were depicted in all kinds of words that suggest that they are animalistic. For me as a US American, originally there are unsettling parallels to the criminalization of African American men as hypersexually and sexually dangerous in American history. Let me go on to the second type of imaging. This one is humanitarian victimization. And I don't want to set up a values scale, but I want to say that it's problematic, and we've all in the Christmas season just been bombarded with this kind of image, a small child with large eyes, looking undernourished, looking out at us. This is that kind of image, asking you to support this or that kind of relief program. Preferred victims in these images of human rights suffering are women, isolated women again. This is the one story, particularly mothers and children. This is an iconic image, you all know it. I probably don't need to tell you about the history. This was the 3rd of September, 2015. This image, which has also been critiqued, why did it move us so much? For many reasons. It's a small child. Alan Kurdi looks as though he's asleep rather than dead. To think about the particularizing work of this image, the images of him being carried by a Turkish soldier who was carrying his body away from the beach, those did not get the kind of dissemination as these singular images of the child's body. It's been critiqued that the boy is white rather than dark-skinned. Is that the reason that it arouses so much affective sympathy? Many of us are parents. We all have affective responses to children. I remember my son was 10 at the time. He said, "Mommy, look at that image. What's going on?" This image became iconic. I'm now at the next image, and was said to have changed Merkel's policy. It was said to have affected the elections in Canada at the time. Even the relatively conservative politician David Cameron on refugeeism said that the UK needed to change its policy, and it went viral and literally spawned a number of other images, artworks in which this small boy became symbolic of the suffering of refugees and the death in the Mediterranean of refugees. And one of the reasons for this is a mural, a graffiti mural in the harbor in Frankfurt, where I live, which subsequently got defaced, and then they did another image. One of the reasons for this is because this image was so effectively resonant, a small boy, a singular boy, is we learned about the boy. We learned his name. He wasn't just a refugee. We learned that his mother and his bigger brother also drowned, and that they left behind them a grieving father. Okay, in this group of images are single refugee women. They are usually veiled, and they're usually shown, the veiling suggests they're Muslim, and they're always shown carrying small children and literally being borne down by small children. To talk about the history of this image, you could say a lot of things. It's a Pieta image, the mother, resonant for us in Christian or post-Christian countries of a mother carrying her child, also resonant with an image of suffering motherhood from the 1930s and the Dust Bowl migrant mother. A mother obviously involved in the work of mothering and parenting borne down by work. These images are incredibly effectively resonant, and although the influx of refugees into Germany was, for the most part, has been an overwhelmingly male phenomenon, when you put in refugee or flight, one tends to get this kind of imagery if the imagery is meant to be sympathetic. And just now moving to the American context, Donald Trump and his zero tolerance policy, no chain migration. Here we see again the singular child as an image of effective resonance. And importantly, this is being shown on Time magazine, very large dissemination, midstream magazine. I can't compare it to things in Finland, I can compare it to things in Germany, but to say how resonant the singular child is in his arousing sympathy. So, in this type of imagery, the central naremes or narrative units and tropes are the presentation of the victim of human rights abuses caused by refugeeism. There's an isolation of the individual versus swarms or waves of refugees. And look and finish, please, to see where you find those kind of naturalized, negative, verbal expressions of influx of refugees. There's a huge preference for children and mothers, young mothers. And there's an evocation both of sympathy and shame on an affective level that goes on here. And recurring tropes are mother, veiled, Muslim, isolated, and burdened. A third type of imagery to which I'm going to devote less time, for reasons of time, are to render the depicted refugee as a holder of human rights. And this type of imagery, very often using different kinds of languages or visual signs signaling that difference also is a commonality, that the underlying narrative is one of the universality of human rights, including the right to migration. And such images, as I argue, stress an equality between us and the refugee or refugees that are being depicted. A equality with the citizens, and that's are us in the privileged global north, of the sovereignty she or he is attempting to take refuge in. So this is an image from 2017, and you can see it's working in many languages: no border, no nation, let's fight together. Here you see one refugee person behind bars or behind a wall, if we were to look to American imagery. Arabic, French, German, and English statements all suggesting equality, human rights, etc. Again, here an individualized man, very often pictured with a fence or a border, telling a story and suggesting that this individual has rights just as we do. And just to look at how differently the image of the refugee child can be seen, a cartoon from The Economist just before the midterms of how the refugee child was being seen by the two political parties in the country where I'm from. Okay. Now, I hope I'm going on to other applications. Are we there, Rika?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So that gives you an idea of how I believe we can take together narrative work with immediately sensitive and literate work with ideological work to perform political analysis. And what I'm trying to do in transfer work is to say, how can this kind of analysis, how can I use this to hopefully increase a kind of media literacy about how certain kinds of images of refugees are being used to elicit very specific kinds of responses, often ones with which I ideologically and politically don't agree. Let me show you some other applications. I'm finishing a book on law right now, but I'm going on, and it's what I don't know how it is for you. I teach things in order to understand them. And I'm working a lot on conflicting narratives on sexual cultures right now. And that has included, on my part, feminist critique of the Me Too movement. And what I'm noticing is that sexual cultures, and I'm not talking about sexual cultures everywhere, I'm talking about them in countries like ours, Finland, and Germany of the global north, that there is a huge amount of contestation about how we should be sexual and how our sexual cultures should be put together. This involves the porn wars since the millennium. You don't know what I'm talking about, but you do. It's the argumentation that, as my grandfather would say, we're going to hell accompanied by the orchestra because porn has become ubiquitous. When my son turns on the computer, before he can get to the Minecraft game, he'll get 100 pop-ups, even with various kinds of cards of various porn, etc., images, etc., etc. It's in advertising. It's everywhere. Porn has become a regularized part of our culture. And this has to do with medial changes, with the ubiquity of things like Pornhub or Kink Hub, which are huge, that everyone, even where there's in countries where there's strong censorship, can now access an unlimited amount of porn online. The porn wars are the argument on one side that, oh heavens, you poor heterosexual men, you can no longer have normal, good sexual relationships because you're all porn addicts. The fear that children no longer have natural acculturalization processes in terms of their sexuality, because the first thing they see are very extreme sexual acts through the ubiquity of porn rather than more initial ones. And a third concern is that young women in particular are being groomed by predatory males because they see so much porn and believe they need to behave like this. This has led to an argument that reminds me of the so-called sex wars and feminism in the 1980s. Should porn become much more, again, censored again, or has this led to a democratization of sexuality so that queers in particular groups can find the kind of sexual imaginaries they want? Binaries of sexuality are being broken down. There are both of those arguments going on. So I see in this kind of work a repressive thesis in the post-Me Too era that is coupled with, in the same time, a gender studies ban in Hungary and renewed violence towards queers and anti-LGBTQI people. So all of these things are going on at the same time. At the same time, a proliferation of what's been called post-porn, I'll explain that in a minute, and transformative sexual projects. So how do we look at something like the music video Anaconda from Minaj from 2014, in which Minaj plays with highly sexualized, arguably also racialized images of black women, uses pornographic tropes, and does so in a way that seems to confront the viewer with her or his tendency to objectify a woman, particularly a black woman, in a sexualized way. Defending this project, Carmen Rios writes, women who choose to express their sexuality are not contractually obligated to do so in line with the male gaze. And an idea from the 1970s from Laura Murphy that we all grow up in aesthetics in which we objectify tits and ass of women, and this works in camera work, etc., etc. And Minaj's own choices often call that gaze into question. The integral spirit of defiance that exists within Minaj's self-imaginary is undeniable. So what's at stake in this right now highly contested sexual cultures are, as I've said, a parallel between the so-called sex wars in feminism of the 1980s and the porn wars in the new millennium. In what is considered healthy sexuality as set against porn sex is always a sexuality that is relational and involves intimacy, connection, and tenderness, as well as creativity. The contemporary anti-porn movement interpolates men then, an ideological term, Althusser, not as oppressors called to relinquish their privileges, but rather as abused victims. This is the concern about porn addiction that's going on. Oh, those poor men, they can't have normal relationships because they're all porn addicts, hence porn itself is inherently problematic. In one articulation of what I see as conflicting narratives in sexual cultures right now is a move towards restriction. And this can be seen in the sexual offense prevention policy, which sets up the tenets of affirmative consent, which is now in many institutions of higher learning. Consent has to be verbalized before sexual activity can go on. Also, the Swedish law on consent from 2018, the government has presented the bill to the Riksdag containing proposals concerning new sexual offense legislation that is based on consent. Sex must be voluntary, it is not, and it is illegal. Okay? And at the same time we have, and this is to say that there are many things going on, and that I believe that we can use actually narratological tools to understand it, in what's called post-porn, which is a breaking down of the binaries of sexuality altogether. And that isn't just the binary of male-female or masculine-feminine, but but also the collocation of top and bottom, that masculine or the masculine figure is always the top, the aggressor, the more active part, and the feminine part is always passive, less interested, and the receptive. And in this image from a queer porn video, you have what we call a bear, a very hot, hairy, larger, muscular man who is on the receptive part of the thinner, more, in classical terms, feminized figure who is the top in the image. And this is to say that, and I'm not giving you a conclusion, only to say that there are many conflicting narratives going on. I believe that what I'm trying to do into understanding where these conflicts are going is to use ideological critique, medial analysis, affect theory, and the tools with which I'm most familiar, narratological analysis, to unpack images like the one you're looking at now. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Greta, for this very rich talk, and I will immediately open up for questions. So, with this mic, Greta can hear.
Yeah, she can hear.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. So, questions? Yes.
Thanks very much.
Could you lean over so I can see you?
The camera is here.
Lean,
The camera is
left, right. Oh, that's where the camera is. Hi there. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. I was wondering if in your research you've come across images with regards to Germany as well that depict kind of, if you like, the corresponding narrative of stability, returning to a stable past where these kind of attacks in particular on white German women didn't happen. I remember one of the AfD members back in 2015 actually compared Cologne to the mass rapes after World War II, kind of suggesting that, you know, in the 70 years between Cologne, or 1945 and Cologne, there were no sexual attacks on women at all, right? It was like the ideal Germany, and now, you know, these men are back and they're doing the same thing. So it's, you know, a threat, and we return to the bad German past, and we would like to return to, a stable, you know, peaceful Germany. So have you found any images that depict that in order to make the crisis narrative more effective, right, as an offer that parties can make to their constituents?
I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Sister, you are so straight on. One of the things that I find incredibly disturbing is that the supporters of the Alternative for Germany party often sound a lot like Trump supporters, in that there's this weird gender nostalgia for a world that never existed, in which men were men and women were women, and good men protected good women, and there weren't, you know, any bad men because they were being kept down. And I think that is this past that existed in which there wasn't any sexual violence. And this is, you know, this is also working a lot with rape reporting and tropes of that existed. And it's nostalgic, and it's incredibly effective politically. And there's just such a history. You know, I think about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States and Birth of a Nation, or lynching. And that worked through the image of a petite blonde woman being attacked by a larger black man. Hence, you needed a good white man to step in and defend her. So I think that's really, really salient. And it would be interesting to see how that kind of imagery is being used, for instance, in the Finnish context.
Okay, next question. Okay, considering the fact that there are so many narrative scholars here, I would like to tease out the question about Greta's argument or critique of a narrative premise. So does anybody want to react to that?
Give me some pushback.
Yeah.
Hello, Greta. So,
Hi, sweetheart.
thanks so much for your talk. So, one small comment about the popular use of the term narrative. So, in the Dangers of Narrative crowdsourcing project that you know about, we've come to the conclusion that a popular use of the term narrative, and in Finnish especially if people say narratiivi, which sort of like refers to the academic use of the term, that's a way to create a backlash against some ideological position so that people would blame each other or other groups by referring to their narrative. And then there is this realm outside the narrative that is clear-sighted, objective, and ideologically sound so this is sort of like the popular use of the term narrative in public discourse in Finland. So a typical right-wing response to the benefactory narratives told by the pictures that you showed, sort of like the campaigning pictures, the right-wing people would say that, well, that's the narrative of the left wing, whereas they are not telling a narrative themselves. So when we are doing this narrative criticism in the political sphere, we are usually told, if we criticize a camp, the camp would come back to us and tell that, well, this is the story of your project that you're criticizing. So isn't Dangers of Narrative a narrative itself? So now it seems that there's this, I don't know, that the descriptive analytical power of the term narrative is really, we've lost the term to those popularizing uses. Do you see what I mean, or do you?
I find it fascinating, and so how do you get the term back? And
yes, to use it analytically.
So how do you reclaim it? Like reclaiming queer, or for feminists, like reclaim bitch. Bitch can be a positive, strong term. Like how do you get it back? And there's probably like a kind of talk that we can do together, and then a talk that we do when we're doing political work. And I guess my first tendency would be to say, like, where does that come from? And I think when a politician is saying, oh, that's your narrative, and there's some objective reality, it's going back to an idea that is narrative, is story, is rhetoric, is fiction, is not true, is not real, in the sense of what's out there is real. And I think to point that out, first of all, and then to throw, and you have the savvy to do that, to throw right back, this is the narrative that you are using right now, and to take it apart really quickly. I also think in political work, and this is one of the reasons I'm working with images, I think I think that images are often instantaneous, and we have a very strong sense that we know what they're telling us, versus when narratives are more complex, people need a little more time, et cetera, et cetera. And I think sometimes working politically with images is very effective. So that might be a way you might put your narrative acumen to work to push back against that populist politician.
Thank you. So I'm afraid that we have to stop here. I would like to thank very much Greta Olson for joining us in Skype. I think your physical energy was indeed so powerful that we felt as if you were here in the room. So thank you very much, and get well soon.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
So we are moving.